At the dawn of Islam, in a time before mosques rose into the sky, before the call to prayer echoed across valleys and cities, before the faith had spread beyond the narrow streets of a single desert city, there was silence, a profound, careful silence. Faith was not proclaimed from rooftops. It was whispered in the shadows of mountains, shared in the privacy of homes, held close to the heart like a precious secret that could cost everything. In those earliest days, when the message of one God was still new and strange to ears accustomed to the worship of idols, when the very idea of equality before the divine challenged every structure of power and privilege that Meccan society had built, in those fragile, dangerous days, there lived a woman whose name would be written into history not through wealth, not through noble lineage, not through the protection of powerful men, but through something far more enduring, through courage, through faith that could not be broken, even when everything else was taken away. Her name was Sumayyah bint Khayyat. To speak her name now is to speak of strength in its purest form. To remember her is to remember that faith, when it is true, asks everything of us, and she gave everything. Sumayyah was not born into privilege. She had no vast estates, no rooms filled with gold and silk, no servants attending to her every need. She possessed no tribal protection, that invisible shield that in the harsh world of pre-Islamic Arabia meant the difference between safety and vulnerability, between respect and exploitation. She was, by the standards of her society, powerless. A woman, a slave, a foreigner in a city that prized lineage above all else. And yet, when the message of Islam reached her ears, when she heard that there was one God who saw beyond status and wealth, who valued the purity of the heart over the pride of ancestry, who promised dignity to the slave and the free alike, she recognized truth, and she embraced it without hesitation. Sumayyah was among the very first people to accept Islam in Makkah. The classical scholars, those who dedicated their lives to preserving the memory of the earliest believers, record her name with reverence. Early historians, reaching back through the generations to touch those first fragile years of Islam, document her presence among the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. She was there at the very beginning, when the community of believers could be counted on two hands, when every new Shahidah was a miracle and a risk. Think of what that means. To be among the first. To have no precedent, no example to follow, no established community to welcome you. To step into faith when the path ahead was entirely unknown. When there were no promises of safety, no guarantees of success, no assurance that this message would survive past tomorrow. At that time, Islam had no army to defend its followers, no state to offer them refuge, no social protection, no legal framework, no powerful allies. The Muslims were a handful of vulnerable souls in a city controlled by those who saw their faith as a threat to everything, to commerce, to tradition, to the entire social order built on inequality and idol worship. To choose Islam in those days was to choose suffering. This was not a hidden cost or an unexpected consequence. It was known. It was inevitable. The Quraysh, the powerful tribe that controlled Makkah, made certain that anyone who abandoned the old ways would pay for it. They had wealth, they had warriors, they had the weight of centuries of tradition behind them. And they were afraid. Afraid of a message that said a slave and a master were equal before God. Afraid of a teaching that said wealth and lineage meant nothing if the heart was corrupt. Afraid of a change they could not control. So they struck out with everything they had. With mockery first, then with threats, then with violence, especially against those who had no protection, those who could be hurt without consequence, the weak, the poor, the enslaved. And Sumayyah, with no tribe to defend her, with no wealth to buy her safety, with no power to shield her from their rage, stood firm. She had found something worth more than safety. She had found truth. She had found her Creator, and she would not let go, no matter the cost. In the scorching heat of the Arabian desert, where the sun could kill a person left exposed too long, where the ground burned beneath bare feet and the air shimmered with heat, she endured. The Quraysh did not simply imprison or threaten the early Muslims. They devised tortures designed to break the spirit, to make faith itself seem like the source of suffering, to force renunciation through unbearable pain. Sumayyah knew what awaited her each day. She knew the stones heated in the sun until they glowed. She knew the ropes that bound believers and left them exposed to the merciless elements. She knew the beatings, the mockery, the deliberate cruelty designed not just to harm the body but to crush the soul. Yet each day she chose faith again. Each morning she woke and did not recant. Each time they demanded she return to the old gods, the old ways, she refused. Her body could be bound, but her heart remained free. They could take everything from her, but they could not take what mattered most. They could not take her faith. They could not force her to bow to any god but the one true God. This was not a momentary decision, a burst of courage that faded when tested. This was sustained, deliberate, conscious faith maintained through days and weeks and months of suffering. This was faith that looked at the worst humanity could do and said, "You cannot have my soul." The Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, would pass by those who were being tortured. His heart breaking for his followers, his beloved companions who suffered because they believed in the message he carried. He could offer them no physical rescue, no army to free them, no earthly power to make the torture stop. But he could offer them something else, something that would endure long after the pain faded. He could offer them truth and hope and the promise of paradise. And to Sumayyah, he offered words that would echo through the centuries. "Patience, O family of Yasser, for indeed your promised meeting place is paradise." Patience, not because the suffering was meaningless, not because it would end soon, but because beyond it lay something eternal. Something so beautiful, so perfect, so full of peace that every moment of pain would be forgotten in an instant of divine mercy. Sumayyah heard those words. She held them in her heart, and she continued, day after day, to choose faith over comfort, truth over safety, eternity over the temporary relief that one word of renunciation might have brought. This was the dawn of Islam. Not glorious battles or grand conquests, but quiet courage in the face of overwhelming darkness. Not power, but powerlessness transformed by faith into something unbreakable. Not the victory of swords, but the victory of the human spirit choosing God even when God seemed to have allowed suffering beyond measure. And Sumayyah stood at that dawn, a light that could not be extinguished, a soul that could not be broken, a woman whose name we still speak with reverence 14 centuries later, because she showed us what it truly means to believe. To understand Sumayyah's story fully, we must understand what it meant to live without protection in the world she inhabited. We must step back and see the structure of Makkan society, the invisible walls and hierarchies that determined whether a person lived in safety or in constant vulnerability, whether they were treated with dignity or as something less than human. Sumayyah was a formerly enslaved woman. Those words carry weight that we, living in different times, might struggle to fully grasp. She had once been property, owned by another human being, her will and her body not her own. Even after gaining her freedom, the mark of enslavement followed her like a shadow in a society obsessed with lineage and status. She was a foreigner, originally from Abyssinia, far from the land of her birth, without the deep roots in Makkan soil that might have offered some measure of belonging. She was married to Yasser ibn Amir, a man whose story also spoke of displacement and searching. Yasser had come to Makkah from Yemen, seeking a lost brother, and had remained in this merchant city, making a life as best he could. But he too had no powerful tribe, no network of kinsmen who would stand behind him, no family name that commanded respect or fear. He had found work, built a modest life, and married Sumayyah. Together, they formed a family on the margins of Makkan society, people who worked and lived and loved without the privileges that others took for granted. They had a son, Ammar ibn Yasser, a boy who would grow into a man of remarkable character, who would become one of the most renowned companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. A man whose faith would be tested again and again, whose courage would become legendary, whose name would be spoken with honor by generations of Muslims. But in those early days, he was simply a young man, devoted to his parents, watching them suffer for their beliefs, his own heart breaking and hardening with determination in equal measure. This was the family: Sumayyah, Yasser, and Ammar. 3 people bound by love and by faith, standing together in a world that saw them as expendable. In the rigid tribal society of Makkah, a person's survival often depended less on their own capabilities than on the strength of their tribal affiliations. The tribe was everything. It was your protection, your identity, your insurance against injustice. If someone harmed you, your tribe would demand justice or exact revenge. The threat of retaliation kept people safe. It created a harsh but effective form of social order. You could not simply attack someone without consequence, because their kinsmen would make you pay. But what if you had no tribe? What if you belonged to no powerful clan? What if there was no one to retaliate on your behalf? Then you were vulnerable in ways that are difficult for us to imagine. You could be harmed with impunity. You could be cheated, exploited, beaten, even killed, and there would be no consequences for those who wronged you. You existed outside the protective structures of society, and that made you a target. For Sumayyah and her family, this meant one thing, and one thing only: they were defenseless. When they accepted Islam, when they took that step of faith that changed everything, they stepped fully into that vulnerability. They made themselves targets not just for random cruelty, but for deliberate, systematic persecution. Because the Quraysh, the ruling tribe of Makkah, had decided that Islam was a threat, and they would crush it by crushing those who were too weak to fight back. The Quraysh were not fools. They understood power and how to wield it. They did not waste their energy trying to harm those who were protected. They did not attack members of powerful clans, knowing that such attacks would spark blood feuds and cycles of revenge that could destabilize the entire city. They were strategic in their cruelty. Instead, they focused on the weak, on the enslaved, on the foreigners, on those without tribal protection, on people exactly like Sumayyah and her family. They could torture these believers without fear. No army would come to their rescue. No powerful chief would demand justice. No threat of retaliation would stay their hands. The weak could be broken without consequence, and in breaking them, the Quraysh hoped to break Islam itself. The family of Yasser became among the most brutally abused of all the early Muslims. Day after day, they were dragged out into the burning desert. Not for a moment, not for an hour, but for entire days. From the time the sun rose until it set, they were left exposed to elements that could kill. The heat of the Arabian desert is not like heat in other places. It is absolute, merciless, the kind of heat that makes breathing difficult, that bakes the moisture from your body, that turns your skin red and then dark, that brings on confusion and hallucinations. And they were not simply left to endure the heat. That would have been cruel enough. No, their persecutors made certain the suffering was maximized. They were bound so they could not seek shade or water. They were beaten so that pain was added to heat exhaustion. They were mocked so that psychological torture accompanied physical agony. Their persecutors wanted them to break, wanted them to renounce Islam, wanted them to say the words that would make the torture stop. Just say the words. Just deny Muhammad. Just return to the old gods. Just bow your head and this will end. How easy it would be. How tempting when your throat is parched and your skin is burning and your body is screaming for relief. Sumayyah refused. Day after day, she refused. Her body weakened, but her spirit remained iron. They could destroy her flesh, but they could not touch her faith. Yasser, her beloved husband, stood beside her in suffering. He too was tortured. He too was given the same choice, faith or relief. And he too chose faith over and over, until his body could take no more. The torture killed him. He died for his beliefs, died rather than deny the truth he had found, died knowing that his wife and son watched him suffer, but also knowing that they understood why he could not renounce Islam. Imagine Sumayyah watching her husband die this way, watching the man she had built a life with, the father of her son, succumb to torture because he would not abandon God. The grief must have been overwhelming. The loneliness must have been crushing. But did she break? Did she use his death as a reason to save herself, to tell her torturers what they wanted to hear so she could live? No. She continued. She endured. She kept her faith even as her heart shattered with loss. And Ammar, their son, watched both his parents suffer, watched his father die, watched his mother endure torture that would have broken most people in hours. He was tortured alongside them, his own body subjected to the same cruel heat, the same beatings, the same demands that he renounce Islam. The pressure on him was immense, not just the physical pain, but the emotional agony of watching his parents destroyed before his eyes. The Quraysh knew what they were doing. They understood that watching loved ones suffer is sometimes worse than suffering yourself. They used this knowledge, wielded it like a weapon. They wanted to break these three people, to make them an example that would terrify others away from Islam. But what the Quraysh did not understand what they could not understand because they worshipped power and wealth and status, was that faith can make people stronger than any worldly force. That when someone has found truth, when they have touched something eternal, when they have connected their heart to the divine, then even the worst this world can do becomes bearable. Not easy, not painless, but bearable, because the soul is anchored to something beyond this temporary life. Sumayyah had no protection from men. She had no tribe to defend her, no wealth to buy her safety, no power to make her persecutors hesitate. But she had something infinitely greater. She had Allah. She had faith. She had certainty that this suffering was temporary, but paradise was eternal, that this pain would end, but truth would never fade, that her persecutors could take her life, but they could never take her soul. And so she endured. A woman without worldly protection, but protected by something far greater. A woman without tribal power, but empowered by faith that moved mountains. A woman the world saw as weak, but who proved to be stronger than those who tortured her. Because they broke. In the end, they broke. Their cruelty failed. Their torture did not achieve what they wanted. Islam did not die. The believers did not recant. And Sumayyah's name would be remembered with honor, while her torturers would be remembered with shame. This was what it meant to live without protection in Makkah. And this was what it meant to have faith so strong that no worldly protection was needed. There are places in the world where the sun is not merely warm, not simply bright, but utterly relentless. The Arabian Peninsula is such a place. In Makkah, when the sun reaches its zenith, the world becomes an oven. The air itself seems to burn. The sand radiates heat like coals in a fire. Shadows shrink to nothing. There is nowhere to hide, nowhere to find relief. Even breathing becomes difficult, as if the air has been stripped of everything that sustains life. It was into this merciless heat that Sumayyah, Yasser, and Ammar were dragged day after day. This was not an accident of circumstance. This was not simply neglect or indifference. This was deliberate, calculated torture. Their persecutors understood exactly what the desert sun could do to the human body. They understood that there are few things more agonizing than being unable to escape heat that bakes you from without and within, that saps every ounce of moisture from your body, that makes your head pound and your vision blur and your thoughts scatter like dust in the wind. The family of Yasser was taken to open ground, places where there was no shelter, no shade, no respite whatsoever. Public spaces where their suffering would be visible, where others would see what happened to those who chose Islam, where their torture would serve as a warning and a spectacle. The Quraysh wanted everyone to witness this. They wanted fear to spread. They wanted other Muslims, and those who might consider becoming Muslim, to see the price of faith and to think twice before paying it. Sumayyah stood in that sun, hour after hour, her body trembling, not from cold, but from the way extreme heat can make the muscles shake uncontrollably, her lips cracking, her skin burning, dehydration setting in, that particular torture where your body begins to shut down from lack of water, where your heart races and your kidneys strain and your very cells cry out for moisture that will not come. But even this was not enough for her tormentors. Even this level of suffering did not satisfy their cruelty or their determination to break these believers. Historical reports, preserved through the centuries by scholars who interviewed those who remembered, who traced the chains of narration back to eyewitnesses, describe additional torments that seem designed by those who had made a study of human suffering. Sometimes the family of Yasser was forced to wear heavy armor while standing in the sun. Think about what this means. Armor, metal that absorbs heat, that becomes scorching to the touch under the desert sun, that traps body heat and turns the space between metal and skin into a furnace. Armor that adds crushing weight to bodies already weakened by heat and dehydration and starvation. The metal would heat throughout the day, growing hotter and hotter until it burned the skin it touched. There was no way to remove it, no way to create distance between flesh and the metal that seared it. Just constant, increasing pain added to the agony of the heat itself. A torture within a torture, layers of suffering piled upon each other until the body and mind reached their absolute limits. And they were beaten, struck with fists and sticks and whatever implements their torturers chose. The beatings were not quick, not efficient, not designed to simply cause pain and end. They were prolonged, deliberate, aimed at places that would hurt most. The violence was both physical assault and psychological warfare, each blow a reminder of their helplessness, each strike an assertion of power over them, each moment of pain accompanied by the knowledge that it could stop, that one word would end it all. They were humiliated, mocked, subjected to verbal abuse designed to strip away dignity and hope. Their tormentors laughed at their pain, made jokes about their suffering, called them fools for choosing faith over comfort, for holding on to beliefs that brought them nothing but agony, tried to make them feel ashamed of their choice, isolated in their conviction, foolish for not simply giving in. And always, always, the demand was the same: renounce Islam. Just say you were wrong. Just admit Muhammad is not a prophet. Just return to the old gods, the idols of stone that your fathers worshipped. Just speak the words, and this ends. Water, shade, rest, relief, all of it yours for the price of a few words. A few words that would betray everything you believe, but would save your body from this unbearable torture. It would have been so easy. The words were right there. The relief was within reach. Anyone would understand. Anyone would forgive you for choosing survival over suffering. Who could blame you for wanting the pain to stop? But Sumayyah would not speak those words. She would not trade her faith for comfort. She would not sell her soul for water. She would not abandon the truth she had found, the God she had come to know, the certainty that had transformed her life, simply because men with cruel hands and crueler hearts demanded it. Her husband Yasser stood beside her, enduring the same torments. His body was older, perhaps less able to withstand the brutal conditions, but his spirit was just as strong. He too refused. He too held firm. Man and wife, united not just in love but in faith, suffering together, supporting each other through agony that would have broken most people in moments. And their son Ammar, watching his parents destroyed slowly before his eyes, enduring his own torture while witnessing theirs. The pressure on him was immense beyond measure. To see your mother beaten, to hear your father's labored breathing as heat exhaustion sets in, to know that a few words from you might make them stop, might give your parents relief, might save the people you love most in this world. But those words would be a lie, and lies, even merciful ones, even ones spoken under unbearable duress, would betray everything his parents had taught him, everything they were suffering to uphold. In the midst of this horror, there were moments of light, brief, precious moments when the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, would pass by. He knew where they were. He knew what was being done to them, and his heart broke for them. these beloved companions who suffered for believing in the message he carried, for accepting the truth that God had revealed through him. He could not stop the torture. He had no army, no power, no worldly authority to command the Quraysh to cease their cruelty. But he could offer something more lasting than physical rescue. He could offer words of comfort, words of truth, words that would echo through time and give strength not just to them, but to every believer who would face persecution in the centuries to come. "Patience, O family of Yasser," he would say, his voice gentle but firm, filled with love and sorrow and certainty all at once. "Your promise is paradise." Patience, not because the suffering was meaningless or would end soon, but because beyond it lay something so beautiful, so perfect, so far beyond this temporary pain that every moment of agony would be as nothing compared to the eternal joy that awaited them. Your promise is paradise, not a hope, not a possibility, a promise, a certainty, a guaranteed reward from God Himself for their steadfastness, their courage, their refusal to break. Sumayyah heard those words. In the midst of unbearable heat and pain and exhaustion, she heard them, and they sustained her. They reminded her why she endured. They gave her strength to face another hour, another day, another night of suffering. The words became immortal because they spoke to something universal in the human experience. We all face suffering. We all encounter pain that seems unbearable, trials that test the very limits of our endurance. And in those moments, we need to know that our suffering has meaning, that our patience has purpose, that beyond this darkness lies light. For the family of Yasser, those words were not abstract comfort. They were concrete truth. They were a promise from the prophet of God, and through him from God Himself. And that promise made everything bearable. But still, the torture continued. Still, day after day, they were dragged into the sun. Still, the beatings came. Still, the demands to recant were shouted at them. Still, their bodies weakened and their strength faded, and the toll of prolonged torture accumulated in ways that could not be undone. The Quraysh were relentless. They had decided to make an example of this family, and they would not stop until they achieved their goal. Either the family of Yasser would break and renounce Islam, proving that faith could be tortured out of people, or they would die, proving that opposing the Quraysh came with the ultimate price. What the Quraysh did not understand, what they could never understand because they had never experienced faith that transcended worldly concerns, was that for Sumayyah and her family, there was no choice to make. They had found truth. They had connected to the divine. They had tasted certainty. And once you have tasted such things, once you have seen beyond the veil of this temporary world to the eternal reality that lies beneath, you cannot unsee it. You cannot unfeel it. You cannot pretend it doesn't exist simply because acknowledging it brings suffering. So they endured. Under the Makkah sun, they endured. Through beatings and mockery and the slow destruction of their bodies, they endured. With the promise of paradise echoing in their hearts, they endured. And their endurance would become legend. Their patience would become an example for every generation that followed. Their suffering would not be forgotten or dismissed or treated as tragedy without meaning. It would be remembered as the price of faith, the cost of truth, the sacrifice that helped Islam survive its most vulnerable moment. Under the burning sun of Makkah, with no protection but God, with no relief but the promise of paradise, with no weapons but patience and faith, Sumayyah stood firm. and the world would never be the same. There are moments in history when the entire course of human events pivots on a single act of courage. When one person's choice reverberates through centuries, changing not just their own fate, but the fate of millions who will come after them. When someone stands at a crossroads and chooses the harder path, the nobler path, the path that leads through suffering to something transcendent. This was such a moment, and Sumayyah stood at its center. The torture had continued for days, for weeks, perhaps for months. The historical sources vary on exact timelines, but they agree on this. The suffering was prolonged, systematic, and brutal beyond measure. Sumayyah's body had been pushed past limits that most people never approach. She had endured heat that should have killed her, beatings that should have broken her, dehydration and starvation and exhaustion that should have destroyed her will to continue. But still she lived. Still she believed. Still, each time they demanded she renounce Islam, she refused. Her refusal had become something that puzzled her torturers. They understood power. They understood fear. They understood that pain, when applied sufficiently, could make anyone do anything. That was how the world worked. That was the natural order of things. The strong controlled the weak. The powerful broke the powerless. It was inevitable. It was simply how things were. Yet here was this woman, elderly by the standards of her time, her body worn by years of hard labor and recent months of torture. A woman who had been enslaved, who had no wealth, no position, no worldly reason to hope for anything. A woman who could end her suffering with a single sentence, who could buy her life with a few words of renunciation. And still she refused. It made no sense to them. It challenged everything they believed about power and control. And challenges to power, even silent ones, even ones made by people who seem to have no power at all, are dangerous things to those who rule through fear. On one particular day, during one of the public torture sessions that had become almost routine, a figure approached. Not just another member of the crowd, not just another Qurayshi observer watching the spectacle. This was someone significant. Someone whose very presence changed the atmosphere, made the air feel heavier, made even other torturers step back slightly. Abu Jahl. His name, given to him by the Muslims, meant Father of Ignorance, a title that captured perfectly his role as one of Islam's most vicious, most implacable enemies. His birth name was Amr ibn Hisham, and he had been a man of some intelligence and capability. But he had chosen to use those gifts in service of cruelty and oppression. He had made himself Islam's enemy not through ignorance or misunderstanding, but through active, deliberate, sustained malice. He was wealthy. He was influential. He was feared. People stepped aside when he walked through the streets. His words carried weight in Quraysh councils. When he spoke, others listened. When he acted, others followed. He was the embodiment of Makkan power and privilege, a man who had never known vulnerability, never experienced powerlessness, never had to bow his head to anyone. And he hated Islam with a passion that bordered on obsession. He saw it as a threat to everything he valued: his wealth, his status, his control over others, the entire social order that elevated men like him and kept people like Sumayyah in their place. He had participated in the persecution of Muslims from the beginning, had encouraged others to torture and abuse the believers, had made certain that the weak suffered most intensely. Now he came personally to confront Sumayyah. Perhaps he saw her continued resistance as an affront to his authority. Perhaps he believed that he, with his power and his cruelty, could break this woman where others had failed. Perhaps he simply wanted to assert dominance, to remind everyone watching that he was in control, that no one could defy the Quraysh and survive. He stood before her, this powerful man before this broken woman. She could barely stand. Her body was failing, weakened past the point where most people could even remain conscious. The sun beat down mercilessly. The ground burned beneath her feet. Every breath was an effort. Every heartbeat was a struggle. And he spoke to her. The historical accounts tell us he insulted her, his words designed to wound as deeply as any physical blow. He mocked her faith, her prophet, her God. He called her a fool for choosing suffering over comfort, for believing in things unseen rather than accepting the reality of power that stood right before her. He questioned her intelligence, her worth, her very humanity. He threatened her, made clear exactly what would happen if she continued to refuse. The torture would intensify. The suffering would increase. There would be no rescue, no relief, no mercy. She would die here in the dust, her body destroyed, her name forgotten, her sacrifice meaningless because Islam itself would be crushed just as she was being crushed. And then he pressured her, one final time, to abandon her faith. Just say the words. Just deny Muhammad. Just return to the old ways. Just bow your head and acknowledge that he, Abu Jahl, the embodiment of Quraysh power, was stronger than her faith, stronger than her God. It was a test, a final ultimatum, a moment where everything hung in the balance. Sumayyah looked at him. This woman who had every worldly reason to give in, who could have justified surrender to anyone, who had suffered more than any human should have to endure. She looked at this man who represented everything the world defined as powerful, who could kill her with a word, who held her life in his hands as casually as one might hold a pebble. And she refused, not with a grand speech, not with dramatic declarations, simply, firmly, with the quiet dignity of someone who knows truth and will not betray it. She refused. She would not renounce Islam. She would not deny her prophet. She would not abandon her God. Not for comfort, not for life, not for anything this world could offer or threaten. Think about what this moment represents. An elderly woman, poor, formerly enslaved, surrounded by enemies, her body broken, her husband dead from the same torture she endured, her son watching, helpless to protect her, the most powerful men in Makkah arrayed against her. No escape, no hope of rescue, no worldly reason to continue resisting. Yet unbroken, utterly, completely, magnificently unbroken. Her refusal was an earthquake in the foundations of everything Abu Jahl believed. He had power, and power was supposed to be absolute. He had wealth, and wealth was supposed to command obedience. He had force, and force was supposed to break resistance. Yet here stood this woman, this powerless, vulnerable, suffering woman, and she would not break. She would not bow. She would not submit to anything except God. It enraged him. The fury that rose in him was not just anger at Defiance, but something deeper, a rage born of fear. Because if this woman with nothing could resist him with everything, then what did his power actually mean? If faith could make someone stronger than torture, stronger than death itself, Then what good were all his wealth and influence and control? The rage overwhelmed him. In that moment, reason fled. Strategy disappeared. All that remained was fury at this woman who dared to remain faithful, who dared to defy him, who dared to prove that there were things stronger than the power he wielded. He took a spear. Perhaps it was his own. Perhaps he grabbed it from a guard. The sources preserve what happened next, but not every detail of how it unfolded. What they agree on is this: Abu Jahl, in his fury, in his rage at being defied by someone he considered beneath him in every worldly way, took that spear and stabbed Sumayyah. Not a quick, clean death. Not an honorable end in something that could be called combat. A murder. An execution. The violent silencing of a voice that would not be silent. The destruction of a spirit that would not be broken. She fell. This woman who had stood firm through months of torture, who had endured more than most humans ever face, who had maintained her faith through suffering that should have been impossible to bear, she fell. Her blood spilled onto the sand of Makkah. Her body, broken and tortured and pushed beyond all limits, finally failed. Her son Ammar cried out. The other Muslims who witnessed it felt their hearts shatter. Even some of the Quraysh who had participated in the persecution felt a chill, a sense that something terrible had happened, that a line had been crossed that could not be uncrossed. Abu Jahl had killed her, had murdered an unarmed woman in cold blood, had proven not his strength, but his weakness, had shown that when faith cannot be broken, when the spirit refuses to submit, the only response power has left is violence. At that moment, as Sumayyah's life left her body, as her soul departed this world of suffering for the paradise she had been promised, as her long ordeal finally ended and her eternal reward began, at that precise moment, Sumayyah bint Khayyat became the first martyr in Islam, the first shahidah, the first to give her life completely, to pay the ultimate price, to prove that faith was worth more than breath itself. She had defied tyranny not with armies or weapons or political maneuvering. She had defied it simply by remaining faithful, by refusing to let them control what mattered most: her soul, her beliefs, her relationship with God. They could take her body, they could take her life, but they could never take her faith. And in the end, that was a victory more complete than any military conquest, more lasting than any worldly power. Abu Jahl thought he had won. He thought he had silenced defiance, crushed resistance, proven that the Quraysh were supreme. But he was wrong. So utterly, completely wrong. Because Sumayyah's death did not end her witness. It began it. Her martyrdom did not weaken Islam. It strengthened it. Her sacrifice did not make believers afraid. It made them more determined. Her name did not fade into obscurity. It echoed through the centuries. And Abu Jahl's name? Also remembered, but not with honor, not with respect, with contempt, with pity, as the man so weak in his certainty that he had to murder an elderly woman to silence her, as the embodiment of tyranny that rages against truth and loses even in victory. Sumayyah won. Standing there in defiance, refusing to break, accepting death rather than betrayal, she won. And Islam, carried forward by people like her, people willing to sacrifice everything for truth, Islam survived. Islam grew. Islam spread across the world. All because a woman with nothing except faith chose to keep it, no matter the cost. In a world filled with stories, with tales passed down through generations, with legends that grow and change and bend with each telling. There are some accounts that stand apart. Some narratives that are not embellished or mythologized or transformed into something larger than life, but are simply preserved, carefully, meticulously, faithfully, because they are too important to lose, too meaningful to alter, too true to need any adornment. Sumayyah's story is such an account. This is not legend. This is not folklore invented by later generations to inspire faith or create heroes. This is not a tale that grew in the telling, that became grander with distance, that transformed an ordinary person into something superhuman. This is history, documented history, preserved with the same care and rigor that scholars of early Islam applied to every detail of the Prophet's life and the lives of his companions. Her story appears in the earliest seerah literature, the biographical accounts of the Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him. These texts, compiled by scholars like Ibn Ishaq and Ibn Hisham, who worked within a century of the events they described, drawing on eyewitness testimony and chains of narration that could be traced and verified. These were not creative writers looking to craft compelling narratives. These were historians attempting to preserve truth, to document what actually happened in those crucial early years of Islam. Sumayyah's martyrdom appears in the biographical dictionaries, the vast encyclopedic works that cataloged the lives of the companions. Scholars spent lifetimes gathering these accounts, interviewing those who remembered, checking narrations against each other, preserving the details that would allow future generations to know who these people really were, what they really did, how they really lived and died. Her name appears in the works of scholars across the centuries. From the earliest generations to the medieval period to the modern era, Islamic scholarship has consistently recognized Sumayyah bint Khayyat as the first martyr of Islam. There is no controversy about this, no debate among historians, no competing claims. The scholarship is clear, the sources are consistent, the acceptance is universal. This matters. In an age where we are often skeptical of religious accounts, where we question whether the stories we hear are historical or hagiographical, where we wonder if the heroes of faith are real people or idealized constructs, Sumayyah's story stands on solid historical ground. She was real. Her suffering was real. Her sacrifice was real. Her martyrdom was witnessed, recorded, preserved, and transmitted with care. But why? Why does her story endure? Why has her name been remembered for 14 centuries? Why do Muslims across the world still speak of Sumayyah bint Khayyat with reverence and love? Because her story carries a message that transcends time and place. A message that was revolutionary in 7th century Arabia and remains powerful today. A message about what truly matters, about where real honor comes from, about what gives a life meaning and value. In the world Sumayyah lived in, honor was determined by very specific criteria. You were honored if you came from a noble tribe, if your lineage could be traced to respected ancestors, if you could claim descent from the great families that had ruled Makkah for generations. Blood mattered. Lineage was everything. Your family name determined your place in society before you ever took your first breath. You were honored if you were male. In pre-Islamic Arabia, to be born female was often considered a misfortune. Girls were sometimes buried alive at birth, seen as burdens rather than blessings. Women had few rights, little autonomy, no voice in public affairs. They were possessions, first of their fathers and then of their husbands, valuable primarily for the children they could bear and the alliances they could cement. You were honored if you had wealth. Gold and silver, herds of camels and sheep, trade goods, and property. These were the measures of worth. The rich commanded respect. The poor were invisible. Wealth meant power, and power meant everything. You were honored if you had status, if you were free rather than enslaved, if you were a citizen of Makkah rather than a foreigner, if you belonged to the community rather than existing on its margins. Status created a hierarchy, and that hierarchy seemed natural, inevitable, unchangeable. Sumayyah had none of these things. None. Not one single source of honor as her society defined it. She was not from a noble tribe. She had no impressive lineage to claim. Her family name meant nothing in the halls of power. She could not point to ancestors who had led armies or ruled cities or been celebrated in poetry. She was, by the standards of tribal society, a nobody. She was a woman, and not just any woman, but one who had been enslaved, who had worked with her hands, who had known the hardship and humiliation that came with being powerless in a world that valued power above all else. She had no voice in tribal councils, no say in community decisions, no platform from which to speak or be heard. She had no wealth. Whatever small possessions she and her family had accumulated through their labor would have been modest at best. There were no treasuries to draw on, no inheritance to rely on, no financial resources that could buy influence or protection or even basic comfort. She had no status. She was formerly enslaved in a society where that mark never entirely faded. She was a foreigner from Abyssinia, always slightly outside the Makkah community, no matter how many years she lived there. She belonged to no powerful clan, had no network of kinsmen, existed on the absolute margins of a society that was harsh even to those at its center. By every measure her world used to assign value, she had nothing. She should have been forgotten. In the natural course of things, her name would never have been recorded. Her life would have left no mark. Her death would have passed unnoticed except by the few who loved her. Yet she attained a rank that history could never erase. Her name is known by hundreds of millions of Muslims across the world. Her story is taught to children, studied by scholars, referenced in sermons and lectures and books. She is honored, revered, held up as an example of faith at its finest. How? Why? What changed? Islam changed everything. The message that Prophet Muhammad, peace and blessings be upon him, brought was revolutionary precisely because it inverted all these worldly measures of worth. It declared that in the sight of God, what mattered was not your ancestry but your actions, not your wealth but your character, not your gender or status or tribal affiliation but the condition of your heart. Indeed, the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is the most righteous of you. This verse from the Quran demolished the entire social hierarchy that had seemed so solid, so natural, so unchangeable. It said that honor comes from faith and righteousness, from submission to God and adherence to truth, from patience in adversity and steadfastness in the face of trials. By this measure, the only measure that truly matters, Sumayyah was nobility itself. She had faith that could not be shaken. She had righteousness that withstood every test. She had patience that endured months of torture. She had steadfastness that neither pain nor death could break. She showed that a woman could have courage equal to any warrior, that the enslaved could have dignity surpassing any king, that someone with no worldly power could be stronger than those who ruled empires. She proved that faith is the great equalizer, that before God, all the distinctions human beings create to separate themselves from one another are meaningless. Her story endures because it reminds us of what Islam came to teach, that we are all equal before our Creator, that no one is inherently better than anyone else because of accidents of birth or fortune, that true honor is earned through character and faith, not inherited through bloodlines or purchased with gold. It endures because it gives hope to the powerless, dignity to the marginalized, value to those whom the world overlooks. If Sumayyah, with nothing the world valued, could attain such rank, such honor, such an eternal place in the hearts of believers, then perhaps we too, regardless of our circumstances, can aspire to something meaningful. Perhaps we too can live lives that matter, that leave a mark, that testify to truth. Her story endures because it sets a standard. When we face our own trials, when we encounter pressures to compromise our faith, when we must choose between comfort and conviction, we can remember Sumayyah. We can remember that she faced pressures infinitely greater than most of us will ever encounter, and she did not break. We can ask ourselves, if she could remain faithful under torture, can I not remain faithful in my much smaller struggles? It endures because it honors sacrifice. In every generation, there are people who pay a price for truth, who suffer because they will not compromise their principles, who choose the harder path because it is the right one. Sumayyah's story validates their sacrifice. It says that such choices matter, that such courage is seen, that such faith is rewarded even if not in this world. It endures because it is beautiful. There is something profound in the image of this woman, stripped of everything worldly power considers valuable, standing firm in faith. There is poetry in the contrast between her vulnerability and her strength, between what she lacked in earthly terms and what she possessed in spiritual wealth. There is a resonance in her story that speaks to something deep in the human soul, something that recognizes authentic heroism when it sees it. And perhaps most importantly, her story endures because it is true. Not just historically true, not just factually accurate, but true in a deeper sense. True to the nature of faith. True to the reality of what it costs to stand for truth in a world that often opposes it. True to the promise that God sees and values and rewards what the world cannot see or value or reward. Sumayyah bint Khayyat, the first martyr, a woman with nothing who had everything, a person the world dismissed who changed the world, a soul that seemed powerless but proved that faith is the greatest power of all. Her story endures because we need it. Because in every age, in every place, there are people who need to know that honor is not what the world says it is. That value does not come from wealth or status or the privileges of birth. That a life can be meaningful even if it is humble. That sacrifice is seen even when it seems invisible. That faith, true faith, is worth whatever it costs. 14 centuries have passed since Sumayyah fell in the dust of Makkah, her blood spilled by a tyrant who thought he could destroy what she represented. Those centuries have seen empires rise and fall, civilizations flourish and fade, countless stories told and forgotten. But her story remains. Her name remains. Her example remains. Because what she stood for, faith over comfort, truth over safety, God over everything, these are eternal. These do not fade with time. These do not become irrelevant or outdated or obsolete. As long as there are people who believe, who struggle to maintain faith in difficult circumstances, who face pressures to compromise their principles, who must choose between what is easy and what is right, Sumayyah's story will endure. Her light will continue to shine. Her witness will continue to inspire. She had nothing the world valued, yet she attained everything that truly matters. And that is why, when we speak of the heroes of faith, when we count those who gave everything for truth, when we honor those who proved that the human spirit cannot be broken, we begin with her name. Sumayyah bint Khayyat, the first martyr, the unbreakable woman, the soul that showed us all what true honor means. When we think of legacy, we often think of monuments, grand structures that rise into the sky, made of stone and marble, built to last for centuries. We think of kingdoms established, territories conquered, borders drawn on maps that will remain for generations. We think of institutions founded, schools, hospitals, libraries, physical places where a person's influence continues long after they are gone. We think of books written, ideas articulated, philosophies developed and passed down through texts that students will read centuries later. We think of wealth accumulated and distributed, fortunes that will fund causes and support descendants and change lives through the power of gold and silver. We think of positions held, titles earned, ranks achieved in hierarchies that others recognize and respect. These are the legacies the world celebrates. These are the ways we typically measure whether a life mattered, whether someone made a difference, whether their time on earth left any lasting mark. By these measures, Sumayyah left nothing. She did not lead armies. She never commanded soldiers, never developed military strategies, never won battles that would be studied by future generations. Her name appears on no list of generals or conquerors. No territories were gained through her efforts. No enemies were defeated by her might. She did not rule kingdoms. She held no throne, wore no crown, issued no decrees that would govern how people lived. She had no palace, no court, no administrators carrying out her will. She never sat in councils deciding the fates of nations. She never wielded political power that could shape the course of history through policy and governance. She did not leave behind books. She was not a scholar who spent years compiling knowledge, writing treatises that would be copied and studied and debated for centuries. She did not develop new philosophical systems or theological frameworks. There are no volumes bearing her name, no texts where her ideas are preserved in written form for future generations to analyze and learn from. She did not establish institutions. No schools were founded in her name during her lifetime. No hospitals or charitable organizations were created under her direction. No physical infrastructure exists that can be traced directly to her planning and effort. She built no mosques, no community centers, no places where people gather and say, "Sumayyah created this." By the world's usual standards for measuring legacy, she accomplished nothing. She was a poor woman who suffered and died, leaving behind no wealth, no power, no lasting physical mark on the world. If legacy were only about what we build or write or conquer or rule, her story would have ended with her death, forgotten within a generation, lost to the passage of time like countless other lives that came and went in ancient Makkah. But she did something greater, something that transcends all the monuments and kingdoms and books and institutions that crumble and fade with time. Something that cannot be measured by worldly standards because it exists on an entirely different plane. She showed that truth is worth dying for, not in the abstract, not as a philosophical proposition to be debated in comfortable settings, but as a lived reality, as a choice made in the moment of ultimate testing, when everything is at stake, when the cost is absolute. In a world where compromise seemed rational, where survival seemed more important than principle, where anyone would understand if you just said the words they wanted to hear. She chose truth. She proved that there are things more important than life itself, that the integrity of the soul matters more than the preservation of the body, that some betrayals are worse than death. This is not a small thing. This is not a minor footnote in history. This is a declaration that echoes through time, that speaks to every person who has ever faced a choice between convenience and conviction, between safety and sincerity, between living comfortably with a lie or dying honestly with truth. She showed that even the most powerless believer can become immortal in the sight of God, that the hierarchies we create, the pyramids of power where some people sit at the top and others are crushed at the bottom, mean nothing when measured against the only judgment that ultimately matters. Sumayyah had no power. We have established this again and again throughout her story. No wealth, no status, no protection, no voice in the affairs of her community. She was as powerless as a person could be in 7th century Arabia. She should have been forgotten, a nameless victim of a cruel system, one more casualty in humanity's long history of the strong crushing the weak. Instead, she is immortal. Her name is known. Her story is told. Her example inspires, not because she accumulated worldly power, but because she demonstrated something far more powerful, faith that could not be broken, courage that could not be intimidated, devotion that could not be destroyed. God saw her. God valued her. God honored her sacrifice. And in doing so, God ensured that her legacy would outlast all the monuments and kingdoms and books and institutions that seemed so permanent, so impressive, so worthy of remembrance. The palaces of the Quraysh who tortured her? Gone. Dust. The wealth they accumulated? Scattered or lost centuries ago. The power they wielded? Vanished the moment they died. The monuments they might have built, crumbled or forgotten. But Sumayyah, still remembered, still honored, still alive in the hearts and minds of believers across the world. Her legacy is not written in stone that weathers and cracks, but in the souls of those who hear her story and find strength to face their own trials. And so, at the very beginning of Islam's story, at the moment when this faith was most vulnerable, when it seemed like it might be crushed before it could take root, when the future was uncertain and the challenges seemed insurmountable, the first life taken for this faith was not that of a warrior, not someone who could fight back, not a person with power or influence or the ability to defend themselves. It was a woman, a poor, formerly enslaved, elderly woman with no protection and no power. Someone the world considered weak, dispensable, unimportant. And in choosing her as the first martyr, God made a statement that would reverberate through all of Islamic history. A statement about who matters, about what kind of courage is most valued, about where true strength resides. The message was clear. In Islam, honor is not reserved for the powerful. Sacrifice is not the exclusive domain of warriors. Heroism is not determined by physical strength or social status. The first martyr was a woman because women are equal partners in faith, equal bearers of responsibility, equal recipients of divine recognition. The first martyr was poor because wealth means nothing before God. The first martyr was formerly enslaved because freedom and bondage in this world are temporary states that do not determine spiritual worth. The first martyr was elderly because age does not diminish the value of faith. The first martyr had no tribal protection because God's protection is the only protection that ultimately matters. Sumayyah's selection, if we can call it that, though it was not selection but simply recognition of what she chose for herself, set a pattern. It established that Islam would honor those the world overlooked, that it would value qualities the world dismissed, that it would measure worth by standards entirely different from those of Jahiliyyah, the ignorance that had preceded the Prophet's message. Every woman who came after Sumayyah, who faced discrimination or oppression, who was told she was less than, who was denied dignity and respect, she could look to Sumayyah and know that Islam saw her differently, that in this faith, a woman could be the greatest hero of all. Every person without power, without wealth, without status, who struggled to maintain faith in difficult circumstances, they could look to Sumayyah and know that God does not measure them by what they lack, but by what they hold in their hearts. Every believer facing persecution, facing pressure to compromise, facing the choice between faith and safety, they could look to Sumayyah and find the courage to choose as she chose, knowing that such choices are seen, honored, rewarded beyond anything this world can offer. This is legacy. Not buildings that crumble, not kingdoms that fall, not books that are forgotten, not wealth that is spent, but example, inspiration, proof that faith can triumph over any adversity, that the human spirit cannot be broken by the worst humanity can devise, that there is always a choice, even when it seems there is none, to remain true to what we believe. Sumayyah bint Khayyat. Say her name with reverence. Say it with gratitude. Say it remembering that every blessing of Islam we enjoy today, every freedom we have to practice our faith openly, every right we possess as believers, these came at a price. And the first installment of that price was paid by this woman, in her blood, on the sand of Makkah, 14 centuries ago. She refused to surrender her belief, not for comfort, not for life, not for anything. And in that refusal, in that final act of defiance against tyranny, in that unwavering commitment to truth, she became eternal. The tyrant who killed her is remembered only as a cautionary tale, a symbol of ignorance and cruelty, a man whose power and pride meant nothing in the end. But Sumayyah, she is remembered as a hero, as a martyr, as the first to give everything for Islam. Her legacy is not in what she built with her hands, but in what she preserved with her faith. Not in what she conquered, but in what she refused to surrender. Not in words she wrote, but in the example she lived and died demonstrating. This is the legacy of unbreakable faith. Faith that cannot be tortured away. Faith that cannot be threatened into silence. Faith that cannot be killed because it exists beyond the reach of any worldly power. And as long as there is Islam, as long as there are believers who strive to remain faithful in the face of difficulty, as long as there are people who need to know that their faith matters regardless of their worldly circumstances, Sumayyah's legacy will live on. She stands at the beginning of our story, the first martyr, the first to prove that this faith was worth dying for and therefore worth living for. The first to show that when you have nothing but faith, you have everything that matters. Sumayyah bint Khayyat, a name written in the history of Islam with letters of light, a soul that demonstrated the power of faith in its purest form, a woman who showed the world that true strength has nothing to do with physical power and everything to do with spiritual conviction. Her body fell in the dust of Makkah, but her spirit, her example, her legacy, these soared to heights that her murderers could never reach, to honors they could never attain, to a permanence they could never achieve. She lives in every believer who refuses to compromise their faith. She lives in every person who chooses truth over comfort. She lives in every soul that looks at the worst the world can offer and says, "You cannot have what matters most." This is her legacy, not monuments of stone, but monuments of spirit. Not kingdoms that rise and fall, but an example that stands eternal. Not books that gather dust, but a story that remains forever fresh, forever relevant, forever inspiring. Sumayyah bint Khayyat, the first martyr, the unbreakable believer. The woman whose legacy is written not on earth, but in paradise, in the hearts of the faithful, and in the eternal record of those whom God has honored. May God be pleased with her. May her sacrifice never be forgotten. May her example continue to inspire generations yet unborn. May her name be spoken with love and reverence until the end of time. And may we all find, in our own trials and struggles, even a fraction of the faith that sustained her, even a shadow of the courage she demonstrated, even a glimpse of the certainty that allowed her to face death without flinching, to endure torture without breaking, to choose God over everything else. This is the legacy of Sumayyah bint Khayyat, the first martyr of Islam, a legacy that will never die, because it is built not on what perishes, but on what endures forever: faith, truth, and the unbreakable human spirit when it is surrendered completely to God. Her story ends here, in this world. But in the next, in the paradise that was promised to her, in the presence of the Lord she refused to deny, her story continues, in joy and peace and eternal reward. And we, left behind in this world, remember her, honor her, thank God for her example, and pray that when our own tests come, when our own choices must be made, we will have even a measure of what she possessed in abundance: unbreakable faith.